everyone. I've packed a lot into this presentation, okay, which doesn't leave much time for preamble. I perhaps should say a few words about my university, which we think is the world's only logistics university. It's in Hamburg in Germany. It was set up in 2010. I've been there for the past 12 years. It's a legacy project of a very wealthy man, Klaus Michael Kühne, who owns most of Kühne Nagel, the world's biggest freight forwarding company. But in a short time, we've achieved a lot in terms of teaching and research. I'm not a cold chain specialist, but I'll be making a few references to the cold chain in this presentation. I'll also be looking at decarbonisation at different geographical levels. I mean, some of the stuff will be global, some will be European, and some of the stuff will also be based here in the UK. I'd like to start by talking about the climate science. Where are we with climate science? Sadly, not in a very good place at the moment. The UN every year produces what it calls its emission gap report, looking at how close we are to meeting our climate targets. The most recent one in October said that to get on the right trajectory to be net zero by 2050, we need a 45% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions worldwide within the next 8 years. Very hard to do. A month after that, head of the UN, in opening the COP27 conference in Sharm el-Sheikh, said this. He says, "We are on a highway to hell with a foot on the accelerator." Around the same time, there was a journal paper published of what they call climate endgames, which I found the most scary academic paper I've ever read. It's a bit like a peer-reviewed disaster movie, but one of their conclusions is that there are ample reasons to suspect that climate change could result in a global catastrophe. However, as I'm sure you're aware, many governments, many companies have now signed up to what they call the race to zero. That's the race to net zero. But how many of them properly appreciate what net zero actually means? This is my definition of net zero. It's to reduce emissions as much as possible by mitigation, by reduction, measures with any surplus balanced by the removal of CO2 from the atmosphere by carbon sequestration. And it's that carbon sequestration side which I think is very often overlooked. Many climate scientists these days are very concerned about this concept of net zero. Here are just a few of them. They said that within a few decades, we will need to transform our civilization from one that currently pumps out about 40 billion tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere each year to one that produces a net removal of tens of billions. And their feeling is that net zero has licensed this cavalier attitude that many governments and businesses currently take. And I'd like just to begin by looking at carbon sequestration, because if we're not successful in reducing our emissions sufficiently, then we're going to become ever more dependent on the removal of greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. So the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change last year, their mid-range scenario suggests that between 2020 and 2100, we'll probably have to remove 360 billion tons of CO2 from the atmosphere. And to put that into perspective, that's 10 times as much CO2 as the world emitted in 2019. How do we do that? Well, the two main methods that are being proposed for doing this, one is called BECCS, Bioenergy Carbon Capture and Storage, where we grow more biomass, which will remove CO2 from the atmosphere. We will then burn that, but capture the CO2 and bury it. But recent analysis of this suggests that the BECCS projects that we have actually emit more CO2 than they capture because of the energy requirements in the BECCS supply chain. Then there's direct air carbon capture and storage using mechanical and chemical means, devices that we call carbon scrubbers to remove the CO2 from the atmosphere. But that's a very difficult job because CO2 represents only 0.044% of the atmosphere. To put that another way, you have to filter 1,600 tons of atmosphere to capture 1 ton of CO2, which involves the use of enormous amounts of energy, which would have to be green, low carbon energy. This is currently a very immature technology. It was estimated in 2021 that there are only 18 plants in the world can do this, and they removed only about 10,000 tons of CO2. So we're going to have to go from 10,000 tons a year to billions of tons a year if we're going to deal with the climate change problem. So the message here is we should be doing everything we can at the moment to minimize our future dependence on this, and we do that by cutting emissions. Which brings us to logistics. So what's logistics' contribution to CO2 emissions worldwide? Currently, it's between 11 and 12% of emissions come from logistics. As you can see, most of them from freight transport, but also some from the buildings, the terminals. To my mind, nobody has yet carbon footprinted the administrative and IT aspects of logistics in terms of carbon. But and to my knowledge, nobody has yet worked out the emissions from the temperature-controlled part of logistics. If any of you have got a number, I'd be happy to hear it. The figures that are often quoted is that refrigeration, air conditioning, heat pumps collectively represent about 7 to 10% of greenhouse gases. And 3/4 of that tends to come from the energy, and the other quarter from the fugitive emissions, the leaking of the refrigerant gases, which have a very high global warming potential. In the case of freight transport, the feeling is it's going to be a very hard sector to decarbonize worldwide for 3 reasons. Partly because of its almost total dependence currently on fossil fuel, but also because of the very high forecast growth rate of freight movement. The main model we use for this is based in the OECD. They reckon there'll be something like a 2.6 times growth in freight movement worldwide by 2050. And the third problem, of course, is the asset life of the vehicles, the locomotives, the ships, the aircraft, which means the replacement cycle is relatively long. The International Transport Forum that does this modelling projected in 2021 that if current policies were fully implemented, we would still see about a 22% growth in freight-related emissions by 2050. They then constructed the most carbon-friendly radical scenario, which would see those emissions dropping by 72%, but not taking it quite to zero. So how do we decarbonize freight transport? Well, basically, there are 5 levers we can pull. One is just to reduce the amounts of freight movement. Second is to shift as much freight as possible to low-carbon transport modes. Third is to optimize the use of vehicle capacity. Fourth is to improve the energy efficiency of the operations. And the fifth is to cut the carbon content of the energy that we use in freight transport. And just to illustrate how these levers work, this is an interesting graph for emissions from road freight movement in the EU. Unfortunately, I've got no comparable graph for the UK. The white dots you can see in the middle there shows the trend in emissions from road freight in the EU. And you can see in only 3 years of the 19 years there did the emissions actually drop. What it does then is decompose that growth into different components. So above the line, you've got the things that are driving freight traffic growth, predominantly the growth in demand for haulage, but also a modal shift away from rail and water towards road. And then below the line, you've got the things that are reducing emissions, so improved energy efficiency, and also a switch to biofuels, in this case, blending biodiesel with diesel. But you can then look at the relationship between those 5 sets of levers and the growth, and it gives you an understanding of how these levers are all required, really, to help us to decarbonize road freight and other sectors of logistics. So what I'd like to do is to look at each of those 5 levers in turn and see what that will actually entail. So let's suppose we want to try to rationalize the amount of freight movement worldwide. One thing we can do is just reverse the processes that have generated so much freight movement in recent decades. Processes of globalization, wider sourcing, centralization of inventory and production. There's discussion currently about reshoring and deglobalization, but these things are only happening at the margins. Personally, I'm not sure this is going to happen to any great extent. The carbon mitigation costs would be very high for reversing these processes. We could maybe reduce the amount of stuff that needs to be moved. So a lot of talk about the share economy, circular economy. We could design products with less materials. We could digitize more products, converting them from consignments to electrons. 3D printing may help. Big debate about what the net effect of 3D printing might be in the longer term for decarbonization. One thing that will certainly help is the defossilization of the global economy, because in 2020, about a third of all freight movement worldwide was of coal, oil, and gas. So as we phase that out, that will reduce the amount of freight. But there'll be other sectors where we will see a big growth in freight movement, because we're going to have to put in place, obviously, a renewable energy infrastructure, which is both material and transport intensive. Huge growth worldwide currently in air conditioning and the cold chain as well, as I'm sure many of you are aware. Carbon capture and storage, carbon dioxide removal, those processes I mentioned earlier will generate a lot of freight movement. We're going to have to adapt our built environment to climate change, which again will involve a lot of freight movement. And I think currently there are about 220 million people in the world living within 5 meters of sea level. They will have to be rehoused, so there'll be a lot of construction-related transport. So factoring all that together, I'm not confident that we're going to be able to reduce the amount of freight movement. Second thing is to get more freight onto lower carbon transport modes. For good reasons. If you compare the carbon intensity of the different freight transport modes, varies enormously. So here in the UK, the railways have about a 3-to-1 carbon advantage over long distance road haulage. We did a survey in my university of 90 companies across Europe, asking them what they thought was the most cost-effective way of decarbonizing their logistics. And by a significant margin, their main recommendation was shifting freight to lower carbon transport modes. But if one looks at the situation here in the UK, the rail share of the freight market has actually been diminishing in recent years, mainly because the railways have been losing what has been one of their core traffics, namely coal. Not just in the UK, this is a global trend. It seems rather ironic that the reduction in the use of fossil fuels will be depriving the most carbon-friendly transport mode of one of its core traffics. But if you look at this historically and geographically, there are very few countries in the world that have been able to reverse the decline in the amount of freight moved by rail, partly because of what I call a logistical lock-in to the use of road freight. But relating this to the current sector, to the cold chain, worldwide, the railways have not been very good at moving temperature-controlled product. Here in the UK, it just hasn't happened. But there are some recent developments. I mean, I know Tesco now, for example, are using refrigerated containers to move some of their products by rail in the UK, and maybe this will be the start of a bigger trend. Third lever is optimizing the use of logistics assets, in this case trucks. This can yield quite large carbon savings at relatively low or even negative carbon mitigation costs. It's something we can do in the short to medium term while we're waiting for this transition to a new generation of low carbon vehicles. Environmentalists often criticize the logistics industry for inefficiency and underusing vehicle capacity, but often this happens for perfectly good reasons. I mean, over the years as an academic, I've done a lot of research in this area. Often companies are behaving perfectly rationally in not fully loading their vehicles on every kilometre travelled. But nevertheless, I mean, they should be making an effort to fill the vehicles better. A number of things will help here. I sense there's more of a desire these days for companies to collaborate, to share their logistics assets in an effort to cut carbon emissions. Digitalization, I think, is having a favourable impact. We can move to high-capacity transport, consolidating the loads. Uniquely in the world, the UK has increased truck capacity vertically, through the use of double-deck vehicles. Elsewhere in the world, this has happened horizontally by lengthening the vehicles, although I think the current government here in the UK is, again, looking at the possibility of lengthening trucks beyond this sort of current longer semi-trailer vehicle. Just in time gets a lot of criticism for the underuse of vehicle capacity. Environmentalists argue we should be relaxing that principle, I think you've got to be careful. You really have to do a holistic analysis, looking at the effects of just-in-time, not just in the transport operation, but on the carbon intensity of production and warehousing operations as well. And then finally, on this table, there's the physical internet. Can I have a show of hands? How many of you have heard of the physical internet? Right, okay. That does surprise me. I thought maybe more of you would have come across this. It's not the Internet of Things, right? The physical internet would be an attempt to replicate in the real world of logistics the principles of the digital internet, creating open systems, greater utilization of both vehicles and warehouses, remodularizing. The physical internet has been adopted by the European Technology Platform for Logistics as its vision of the future of logistics, 30 to 40 years from now. And the modeling they've done suggests that if we could ever create that model, it would be quite an effective way of decarbonizing logistics. But it's interesting. It's a concept that's well researched and accepted in Europe, but as yet, hasn't really made much impact here in the UK. My fourth lever is improving the energy efficiency of logistics. We can take a longer-term view of this, where technology will obviously help, not just of the individual vehicles, but through the use of platooning or the automation of vehicles. The feeling is computers can probably drive trucks more fuel efficiently than human beings. We're also seeing a proliferation of fuel economy standards for new vehicles. It was estimated by the International Energy Agency that in 2021, 3/4 of all the new trucks sold in the world were in countries with fuel economy standards in place, and those standards are being tightened. And I've not said anything at all so far about shipping, but since 2013, we've had fuel economy standards governing the energy efficiency of new ships. That's the longer term. The shorter term, there are a whole range of things we can do. We can retrofit our vehicles with fuel-saving devices. One of the most cost-effective ways of cutting carbon emissions in the road freight sector is to train the truck drivers to drive more energy efficiently and then to monitor their behavior using telematics. We can improve vehicle maintenance. We can even do more radical things. In 2016, I published a journal paper suggesting we simply slow down freight movement in an effort to cut carbon emissions. And my colleagues thought I'd gone mad. They thought I was a complete heretic. But that's very much what's happened in the container shipping sector. Since 2008, the main way in which we've cut carbon emissions in shipping is simply by slowing down the vessels. And we've now got some large logistics providers reducing the maximum speed on the engine governors as well. So we shouldn't reject that out of hand. And then my fifth lever is cutting the carbon content of the energy we use in the sector. And I suppose the good news here is that we have a lot of alternative energy options for all the different freight transport modes. There's uncertainty currently as to what the energy mix will be in the future for these different freight transport modes. A lot of disagreement as to how this will happen. But one general point I would like to make is that the energies I've represented in green on that slide are the ones that require the decarbonization of electricity. It's where either directly or indirectly we get low carbon electricity into the freight transport sector. Directly, obviously, through recharging batteries or maybe electrifying the highway. Indirectly, by producing green hydrogen, which either then goes into fuel cells or becomes an ingredient in making e-fuels like e-methanol or e-kerosene for aircraft. But this transition to a new generation of low carbon vehicles is going to be a slow one, it seems to me. The big challenge is going to be coordinating the development of the necessary transport and energy infrastructures with the manufacture of this new generation of trucks and ships with operators' fleet replacement cycle. Managing that process is going to be a huge challenge, it seems to me, over the next few decades. If we just look at trucking, there are regulatory pressures here. So at the COP26 conference in Glasgow 2 years ago, and then more recently in COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, About 27 countries have now signed up to a memorandum to phase out the purchase of new diesel vehicles by 2035 for the smaller ones, 2040 for the bigger ones. But even allowing for that, the transformation of truck fleets will take a while. So if one looks at European data, 2019, there were 6.1 million trucks in Europe. There were 360,000 new trucks bought. And if you divide one number into the other, suggests it takes about 17 years to completely replace the fleet. So the move to this new generation of lower carbon vehicles will take quite a long time. The research suggests that it's mainly batteries that are going to be decarbonizing trucking. If you do the total cost of ownership analysis and project it into the future, we're going to get cost parity for long-haul trucks between batteries and diesel much more quickly than we will for hydrogen. I haven't seen a comparable graph to this one for the UK, but this is a graph that the German government published recently, looking at the future energy mix for trucking in Germany, where they reckon it by 2030. 56% of the new trucks will be battery powered, only about 17% will be running on hydrogen fuel cells, and there'll still be some diesel sales, they reckon, by then. And the other thing here is that my hope in the future is that a lot of the recharging of the batteries will be done under a cable. I'm quite a strong advocate of the electrification of highways. We've now had 7 years of experience here in Europe with pilot projects and trials. The beauty of what we call dynamic charging of the vehicle is that it allows you to reduce the size and weight and the cost of the battery in the truck. It also reduces the demand for static charging as well. And the other thing is we don't just have to take the electrical power from the cables to power the engine. It can also power refrigeration equipment on board the vehicles. It's got a high capital cost. So in Germany, they estimate it's about 2 to 3 million euros for one electrified lane in each direction on the Autobahn. But the analysis that's been done suggests in the longer term, this is the most cost-effective way of decarbonizing trucking. But, all of this depends, of course, on the decarbonization of electricity. A quote from a report about the decarbonization of cold chains, again, said the heavy lifting is going to have to be done by the decarbonization of electricity. Well, that really applies to logistics as a whole. Good news is that electricity is decarbonizing more rapidly in the UK than it is in many other developed countries. But we've got other challenges. The logistics sector is going to have to compete with other sectors for the available low-carbon electricity. There are all sorts of worries about the future availability of battery materials for this enormous electrification process. And then one thing I always bang on about, I bought an electric car 2 years ago, and it pains me to see my electric car sitting 95% of the time in the driveway with all of those valuable, scarce battery materials being underused. I think policymakers should be prioritizing the use of these batteries in commercial freight vehicles where they'll be more intensively used and yielding greater CO2 savings. There's also microgeneration, which I think will offer huge potential in logistics, particularly where we cover the roofs of warehouses with solar panels. There was an academic paper published recently estimating that if we were to do this across the EU, sorry, we're no longer part of the EU, but you could get about 25% of future electricity from roof solar. The warehouse I show there was designated the most environmentally friendly commercial building in the world a few years ago. It's operated by Renus Logistics in Tilburg in the Netherlands, covered with 13,500 solar panels, which meets all the energy needs of the building, but also those of about 700 houses in the surrounding area. And of course, the roof solar doesn't just go onto buildings, it can go onto vehicles as well. And I'm aware of a pilot project currently here in the UK looking at the use of trailers with solar panels for refrigerated vehicles. And then I'm almost finished. I've probably exhausted my time, Shane, and if I have, I'm really sorry for that. Going back to the sequestration side of net zero, The feeling is that logistics is a source of greenhouse gases, and it's not a sink. It's very hard in this sector to remove greenhouse gases from the atmosphere, but there is interesting research being done, putting carbon capture and storage on board vehicles or ships. So there's a US company called Remora, there's a French company called Captus, and Aramco, the world's biggest, most profitable oil company, has done work on this as well. In fact, Aramco estimated recently that if you put carbon capture and storage on every truck in the world, you'd save about 708 million tons of CO2 per annum, which is about twice as much as the UK as a whole owns. The beauty of that technology, if it could be made to work and could be scaled up economically, is it would mean we could decarbonizing the existing fleets of diesel vehicles. But it seems to me logistics is going to have a much more fundamental role to play in carbon sequestration, because whatever means we use to do this will involve the movement of a lot of materials. And the logistics companies that do this, hopefully, will gain some carbon credits in the process. So I began rather negatively and maybe rather intimidatingly. I'd like to end a bit more positively to say that I see a big potential business opportunity for logistics businesses here in the whole area of carbon dioxide removal. And I wonder if many of the companies represented here today have really begun to explore that opportunity. Those are my contact details. You can all have a copy of this presentation if you like. I published a book on the subject back in 2018, available from all good bookstores. Yeah, I hope you found that of interest. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alan. A real tour de force, as always, and I think a really good scene setter for the big picture. And it's one of the things we have to bear in mind is we're part of a system. Each of us is a small part of a system, and it's the system overall that's going to have to transform. So my question, starting off, Alan, is you did start in quite a negative place, and obviously try to take it through to if I'm running a cold storage operation or a cold chain operation here in the UK is a small part of the overall problem. My part of the UK is a small part of the UK. Why? It's such a big problem with China and India and all this growth and all these emissions coming in those parts of the world. Why do we even bother?
I suppose you think of Tesco's motto, every little counts, Other
supermarkets are available.
No sector should opt out. Okay, you could apply the same argument to the UK. I think the UK is about 2% of global CO2 emissions, so we're very small. But we all have to make that effort. But I can understand why there's a reluctance to do that. I mean, if one looks at President Xi's announcement in China just a week or two ago, again, committing to invest a lot more in coal-fired power stations, which is the last thing that we need. There are so many trends going in the wrong direction. You can get super pessimistic about all of this. But we nevertheless have to do what we can, and we do it collectively. And we set a good example, perhaps, to other countries in doing that.
And as you concluded, opportunity is here. The economic opportunity of this is significant if you get it right in a number of different ways, whether it's just through brand recognition of doing the right thing or doing these specific things.
Can I just pick up on that point? Because I looking at the decarbonisation, not just of logistics, any sector, it seems to me there'll be three phases. We're currently in what I call the low-hanging fruit phase, where there's still a lot of things you can do to cut carbon that will also cut cost. A lot of it's just good business practice. Unfortunately, harvesting all that low-hanging fruit won't get us to our necessary targets. So we'll then move into a second phase, which I call the rebound phase, when the carbon mitigation costs will go up. And then to get to the really deep reductions, we'll move into what I call the austerity phase, when you'll have to sacrifice profitability, return on investment. But at least the good news is maybe for the next 5 to 10 years, there are things we can do to save money as well as cut carbon.
And I think that's a really important point to bear in mind, is that this is the current phase. If we follow through the logic of the 2050 deadline set by us and other countries in the world, to get there, the urgency is going to ramp up quite dramatically. Do you have a sense of what timeframes we're talking about there? When does the austerity phase start, do you think, broadly speaking?
Well, if one looks at the UK government's commitment, which is to achieve a 38% No, it's a 78% reduction in CO2 emissions against a 1990 baseline by 2035. We're currently 47% of the way there. We've another 31% to achieve. In a sense, we've done the easy thing so far. We've got coal. Yeah. It's going to get harder and harder to achieve that reduction. For me, one of the game changers over that time scale is carbon pricing, right? If you go to the World Bank's website, you'll see a dashboard, and they currently estimate that about, I think, almost a quarter of greenhouse gases in the world are emitted in countries and regions that have got some system of carbon pricing in place. I mean, the biggest one is in the EU, obviously. Yeah. And the expectation is that carbon pricing will be more generally rolled out, which will then cause companies to factor a carbon price into their balance sheets. And it seems to me that will ultimately be the game changer.